Well, good evening. So you guys are the diehards. Well, I'm glad that you're here. If there's one question that I think every human being should ask themselves, and that question is, why am I here? Right? And if you ask me that question, why am I here? My answer would be biochemistry. But I'm not talking about those chemical reactions that are happening inside each of the cells of my body that make my physical existence possible. I'm talking about the discipline of biochemistry. And by the way, biochemistry is the area of science where scientists are interested in understanding the molecules that make up the cell, how they're structured, how they behave in the cell, and then how that chemistry translates to higher order biological processes. And I can't think of a more exciting area in science than biochemistry. And some of the most important insights and advances in recent years in the sciences have come from biochemistry. So it's an exciting area, but it's also an exciting area of Christian apologetics, because I think you can make a very powerful case for God's existence from the nature of biochemical systems. And it was this evidence for God's handiwork in biochemical systems that convinced me a creator must exist. And once I became convinced that a creator must exist, I was open to the gospel. And as I think has been alluded to this weekend, I didn't grow up in a Christian home. My father was a Muslim. He came to the United States after getting a PhD in nuclear physics in Canada. And he, as a Muslim, met my mother, who was a non-practicing Catholic. And usually when a Muslim marries a non-Muslim, that person has to convert to Islam. But my father was a little progressive in his views, and so as long as my mom wasn't interested in practicing Catholicism, he never asked her to convert to Islam. So I grew up in a home where the primary influence I had was Islam. And I can remember when I was 16 years old, seriously exploring Islam, reading from the Quran. I learned how to pray, and after about a year and a half, kind of gave up on Islam and settled into a position of agnosticism. I wasn't sure if God existed or not, and honestly, I didn't really care. By that point in time, I'd worked out some of the rebellion that I was going through as a young man, and when I went to college, West Virginia State, I was a very serious student at that point. I wanted to become a biochemist. And I wanted to do everything I could to prepare myself to go to graduate school so I could get a PhD in biochemistry. I wanted to do research in biochemistry. And so the courses I took at State were great courses. I had great teachers who I respect and admire to this day, but many of them were anti-Christian in their orientation. And they taught that life's origin and life's history was the product of evolutionary processes. And I accepted those ideas really uncritically, and I felt very comfortable in an environment where people, again, were negative towards the Christian faith, because my father had negative feelings towards Christianity as a Muslim. So I felt comfortable, but also the idea that if evolution can explain where life comes from, then why do you need God? It made my agnosticism even that much more comfortable. And I can't tell you how many people I meet, particularly on university campuses, who are convinced if evolution is true, then there's just simply no way that God exists. But when I went to graduate school, something radical happened. I was immersed now in the study of biochemical systems, and I came to appreciate very quickly not only the fact that these systems are unbelievably complex, but the fact that these systems are elegant. They are sophisticated. There's an ingenuity to these systems, and I was taken aback by that. And I asked the question, how do scientists explain where these systems come from? Now, as a graduate student, I was in a very different place than I was as an undergraduate. As an undergraduate, I was just soaking up what my professors taught. But when you go to graduate school, you're now being groomed to think independently in the sciences. And you learn very early on that what you should do if you're going to be a scientist is draw your own conclusions. That you shouldn't depend upon what other people think, that you look at the data and you draw your own conclusions. So I was becoming an independent thinker in the sciences, and so I wanted to know, okay, how do scientists really explain where these systems come from? Hand-waving and just saying evolution wasn't enough. And as I rolled up my sleeves and began to examine explanations for the origin of biochemical systems, which is called the origin of life problem, I found those explanations inadequate. And it was at that point I became convinced there had to be a creator, that there had to be a mind behind life. And so I began to ask myself, who is this creator? Do I relate to that creator? And I was actually going down a path of universalism, where I thought, well, maybe the different religions of the world are different ways that God revealed himself to people. And when I looked at the religious systems of the world, of course, they have very similar teachings from a moral standpoint. And I was very naive when it came to philosophy and religion. And so I thought, well, maybe this is, again, how to think about who God is, that the different religious systems are just ways that God is communicating to different people. Now, I hadn't met my friend Ken Samples by that point, because if I had, he would have pointed out to me that the different religions of the world can't all be true, right? Because they teach very different things when it comes to the nature of God, the nature of reality, the nature of humanity. And so either none of them are true or one is true, but they all can't be true. But again, that was the path that I was going down, this path of universalism. And it wasn't until I met a pastor at a small Pentecostal church in downtown Charleston, West Virginia, that I seriously entertained the gospel. And I was able to seriously entertain the gospel at that point because I was convinced that a creator existed. And so when you're engaged in trying to interact with a skeptic, an atheist, even an agnostic, one of the first things you must do is show them that God exists before you can truly present the gospel to them. Because when I was an undergraduate student, I had friends who were Christians, and they would share their faith with me. And I remember thinking to myself every time they introduced their faith to me, is that, what are these people saying? It's like, I like them, they're great people, but I felt sorry for them that they were believing and embracing that kind of nonsense. But suddenly the gospel took on very different meaning for me when I became convinced that God existed. And what I want to present to you tonight are basically reasons why I believe God exists. And the reasons that I'm going to present to you tonight are basically the same reasons that convinced me 30 years ago as a graduate student that there must be a creator. But then the thing that's very powerful is that the case for God's existence today is much more powerful than it was when I was a graduate student 30 years ago. And the passage that we've been focusing on this weekend is the passage in Romans 1, in this case 18 through 20, which tells us that God has revealed himself to us through the record of nature, that we can clearly see evidence for God's fingerprints in the created order, and I believe that that is very much the case when it comes to biochemistry. And so what we're going to do tonight is, again, lay out an argument for God's existence from biochemistry and from origin of life research. And this is, in my view, one of the most compelling reasons to think that there is a creator. And what I want to do tonight is give you some practical tips on how you can remember this argument. And to remember the argument, you just need to remember the three F's. Fingerprints, that when we look at biochemical systems, we see evidence for God's fingerprints. And in fact, we can take that evidence that we see for God's fingerprints and we can construct a formal argument for God's existence following after the watchmaker argument of William Paley. And we'll unpack that. We also will note that there's another F to remember, failure. That any attempt to try to explain where biochemical systems come from through an evolutionary process has led to failure. And then finally, the third F is fashion. Any attempt on the part of scientists to fashion life or to make life in a laboratory demonstrates in a very powerful way intelligent agency is required to bring about life from non-life. And when you put these three independent lines of argumentation for God's existence together, you have a very powerful weight of evidence argument. And so let's go ahead and take a look at the first F this evening. Fashion. Sorry, check that. Fingerprints. Attempts to create, sorry. I'm getting the F's jumbled in my mind. It's that time of the day, I guess. I needed a longer nap. That was the problem. I got a good nap in, but I needed a longer nap. Okay, the first F are fingerprints. That when we look at biochemical systems, we see evidence for God's fingerprints. Now, one of the things that I find to be really astounding as a biochemist is that when we look at biochemical systems, their defining characteristics are identical to those characteristics that would reflect the work of a human designer. In other words, when we make things as human beings, systems or objects or devices, there's certain characteristics that they possess that reflect the fact that there was a designer involved. And when we look at biochemical systems, their defining characteristics are identical to those of human designs. And so if human designs require the work of a mind, and we have biochemical systems with those same properties, that is suggestive that there's a work of that they reflect the work of a mind as well. This is, again, kind of the watchmaker argument. But there's also something else that's interesting, is that many biochemical systems look like they are identical to the types of systems that we would produce as human designers. And one of those properties or systems has to do with the information systems in the cell. And from our experience, we know that information comes from a mind, right? Whenever you encounter information, it comes from a mind. If you get a text or an email, that contains information. That comes from somebody who's trying to communicate to you. If you see a sign along the road, you know that sign is the work of a mind, ultimately. If you see a pile of rocks on the hillside, that's just a pile of rocks on the hillside that probably came about through some accidental process or some unintentional process or some natural process. But if those rocks are organized to spell out a word like welcome, you know that there was a mind behind the way those rocks were arranged. Information comes from a mind. And what's interesting is that biochemical systems, at their essence, are information systems. A DNA is an information storage molecule inside the cell. It contains digital information. And that digital information is in the form of a sequence of building blocks or subunit molecules that are sometimes called the genetic letters that are abbreviated A, G, C, and T. And it's that sequence of genetic letters, just like the sequence of letters in the English language, that contains information. Letters in the English language can be sequenced to communicate information, to spell out words, to even communicate much more complex ideas by combining words together. And that's very much what's going on within DNA. It's an information storage system. And there's other molecules that harbor information, like proteins. And that information is in the form of a sequence of amino acids that are linked together to form this molecular chain. And the sequence of amino acids determines the structure and the function of those proteins. So biochemistry is essentially information at the end of the day. And again, if there's information, that information must come from a mind. But in addition to that, we've also discovered that it's not just merely the presence of information that is interesting, but that information is actually organized in the same way that we would organize information in human language. This is an insight that comes from information theorists who have studied basically molecular biology. They are astounded at the similarity in the structure of biochemical information in human language. There's a hierarchical organization to that information in biochemistry just as it is in human languages. So it's not just merely the presence of information, but how that information is organized. Now, something else that's really, really fascinating, in fact, this is mind-boggling to me, and that is that the way that the cell's machinery manipulates the information in the cell is the same way that a computer system functions at its basic essence. In other words, that digital information in DNA is manipulated in the cell in such a way that literally the cell's operations are a computer system. And to me, this insight is just mind-blowing. It keeps me awake at night to think about the implications of this. I've known about this for probably over a decade, and I still can't wrap my mind around this insight. And to appreciate this, I want to spend some time on this because this to me is really very, very powerful stuff. To appreciate this, we need to consider the work of British mathematician Alan Turing. How many of you know who Alan Turing was? Yeah, a few of you do. You know, if I asked that question a few years ago, the only people in the audience that would raise their hands were people that studied computer science, because he's considered the father of computer science. But today I find that more people are familiar with Alan Turing thanks to a movie called The Imitation Game. Have any of you seen that movie? I think it's a great movie about Alan Turing's work during World War II. It's a biopic of his work during World War II, cracking the German Enigma code. And in fact, nobody knew that he had done that work until just a few years ago when the British government declassified information from World War II. But Alan Turing, prior to World War II, developed a theoretical foundation for computer science and then applied that to crack the German Enigma code by building the very first computer system. And people believe that he actually shortened World War II by 2 years, saving 14 million lives because of his work on the German Enigma code. So he was very much a war hero, but he probably, in my view, is the most important scientist in the 20th century, even more important than Albert Einstein, because all of the technology that we experience and enjoy today, that we rely on today, that are driven by computer systems, are ultimately the brainchild of Alan Turing and the theoretical work he did prior to World War II. And his genius was to think about computation in machines by developing an abstract machine in his mind called a Turing machine that consists of an input and output and a finite control. And this is a cartoon that's attempting to represent a Turing machine. And so that contraption in the middle is the finite control. And then the zeros and the ones are strings of data that are being fed into the finite control. The finite control alters that digital data in a prescribed manner, producing an output. That's a Turing machine. Input, output, finite control. Turing's genius was to realize that the output of one Turing machine could be the input of another Turing machine. And so by combining Turing machines together, you can perform suddenly very complex computations, whereas each Turing machine can only do very limited operations. But when we look at a process like DNA replication that's shown here in cartoon form, you have the DNA double helix, which again is digital information, and that double helix is unwound to expose single strands that are then used as templates to assemble another strand of DNA that complements the template strand. And as a result, there's two double helices that are generated. But in that diagram, those donuts and balls and blobs and cylinders and things like that that are shown in cartoon form, those are basically proteins that are doing operations on the DNA. And they're working collaboratively to carry out the replication process. But those proteins are basically like the finite controls. And the DNA is digital information, so the proteins are altering the digital information in DNA, producing an output strand. And then the output of one protein is then the input for another protein. So when we look at something like DNA replication, it's an ensemble of Turing machines that are carrying out the operation. It literally is a computer operation. In fact, it's so much like a computer that a few years ago, a scientist by the name of Leonard Adleman at the University of Southern California had this brainchild, this vision of creating computers using DNA and proteins that manipulate them in the cell. This is called DNA computing, and it actually is progressing very rapidly as a nanotechnology, where literally you can build computers in little tiny test tubes that are about this big, and those computers are more powerful than the most powerful supercomputer system that we've ever built. And this is going to be probably some of the computing technology of the future. They're very, very powerful systems. And in fact, they can solve problems that no other types of computer systems can solve because of the capacity to perform massive parallel operations simultaneously, if you're into computer science. But the key point is this, is the similarity between computers and the processes in the cell involving DNA. This is what Leonard Adleman said. The most important thing about DNA computing is that it shows that DNA molecules can do what we normally think only computers can do. This implies that computer science and biology are closely related, that every living thing can be thought to be computing something, and that sometimes we can understand things better by looking at them as computers. When you think about that type of similarity, it brings to mind the watchmaker argument developed by the British natural theologian William Paley in the late 1700s. How many of you have heard of William Paley? Yeah, a few of you have. Well, William Paley developed this argument for God's existence called the watchmaker argument. And in Paley's day, a watch was the pinnacle of engineering accomplishment. And Paley noted that a watch was a contrivance. That was the word that he used. It was a contrivance made up of a number of parts that interact in a precise way to accomplish a purpose. And Paley argued that a watch requires the work of a watchmaker to explain its origin. That unlike a rock, which could be explained through natural processes, Paley argued a watch requires a mind because it's a contrivance. And then he surveyed biological systems and noted that biological systems seem to be contrivances, and he argued that if a watch requires a watchmaker, then life must require a divine watchmaker because of the similarity between biological systems and a watch. Well, we can now make basically a revitalized watchmaker argument based on the similarity between a DNA and computer systems as an example. Because we know from our experience that computer systems come from minds, ultimately from Alan Turing's mind, right? And so if we see in the cell computer systems that are operating, again, that are just like our computer systems, does that not indicate that life itself must come from a divine mind, from a divine computer maker? And this is just one feature of the cell's chemistry where we can make a watchmaker argument. In fact, you could go just to system to system to system and make that kind of an argument. In fact, in my book, The Cell's Design, I basically show how biochemistry gives brand new life to the watchmaker argument and can be used to make, again, a very powerful case for God's existence. And so this is one reason why I think God exists, is because of God's fingerprints that we see in the cell, and we can take that evidence for God's fingerprints and we can construct a formal argument for God's existence. Now, when you make an argument like this to a skeptic, one of the responses would be this response, which is typified by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, where the argument is, yes, indeed, there are these incredibly elegant designs in biochemistry, but those designs come about through essentially evolutionary processes, where evolution can generate those designs through the process of natural selection. In other words, there is a watchmaker, but it's a blind watchmaker of evolution. That's the common rebuttal. And so Richard Dawkins writes in his book, Paley had the proper reverence for the complexity of the living world, and he saw that it demands a very special kind of explanation. The only thing he got wrong was the explanation itself. The true explanation had to wait for Charles Darwin. And that brings us to the second F, and that is this, that any attempt to explain the origin of biochemical systems through this blind watchmaker approach has resulted in failure, has led to failure. And to spend some time developing this, we need to spend a couple of minutes thinking about the ways that biochemists think about biochemistry, the way they categorize biomolecules in the cell. One way is to think about the information harboring molecules like DNA and proteins. We've already talked about that. Another class of molecules are these small molecules that react with each other in the cell to carry out the production of building block materials, to break down materials, to be used for energy sources, to process materials that would be eliminated by the cell as waste. Those collections of reactions are called intermediary metabolism, and they involve, again, small molecules that react with each other to form these linear pathways, these branch pathways, these circular pathways, and they're all interconnected to form this network of reactions inside the cell. Now, you may not have ever heard of intermediary metabolism, but you think about it every day. So, if you have a donut in the morning for breakfast, you basically are consuming vast amounts of sugar, right? And that sugar now has to be processed by the cell or by your body, and it's done in cells, primarily in the liver, that are taking that sugar in the donut and breaking it down into smaller molecules, and in doing so, it's liberating energy that's being captured by the cell and stored to be used later on for other processes in the cell. And of course, if you eat too many donuts in the morning, that sugar that is broken down produces excess energy, and that excess energy is used to drive the production of fats, right? And then those fats begin to accumulate around your waistline and other places. And so you think about intermediary metabolism every day. Now, the production of fats isn't necessarily the greatest thing, but some of those fat molecules are actually very important because they're actually used to build basically cell membranes, which are the boundary systems that separate the interior of the cell from the exterior environment. They create compartments in the cell that help to segregate different operations in the cell. So the three systems that biochemists think about are the information-rich systems, intermediary metabolism, and then cell boundaries. Well, it turns out that each category of biomolecules has spawned an independent approach to try to explain the origin of life. And these are called replicator-first scenarios, metabolism-first scenarios, and membrane-first scenarios. Where, for example, with metabolism-first scenarios, the argument would be metabolic systems emerged first, and then later on, information-rich molecules and membranes emerged as secondary features. So they emphasize trying to explain the origin of metabolism first in metabolism-first scenarios, and so on and so forth. And it turns out that each one of these approaches has basically led to a dead end. Replicator-first scenarios have a long litany of problems associated with them, and some of them are listed in this slide. I'm not going to detail them. That would just be probably too excruciating for you guys to go through all the chemistry involved in highlighting the different problems with these approaches. But suffice it to say that these are very real problems that have stultified this approach in terms of explaining the origin of life. And throughout the conference, I've been exposing you to this statement by Leslie Orgel, right, about it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth. But I was, as I mentioned, I think last night at an Origin of Life conference in Oaxaca, Mexico with Hugh Ross in 2002 when Leslie Orgel made that statement in front of an entire audience of Origin of Life researchers. And so here it's highlighting the fact that there are very serious problems with metabolism first scenarios. But there's also problems with with replicator first scenarios. There's also very serious problems with metabolism first scenarios. And again, some of those problems are delineated in this slide. And we could go through them if you really wanted to this evening. We won't. Just suffice it to say that, again, the problems are so severe that, as I mentioned last night, Orgel basically said that you're looking at an appeal to magic, a series of remarkable coincidences. It's a near miracle. And this, again, is just illustrating how serious those problems are. Today, one of the approaches that's becoming more and more popular are membrane-first scenarios. Many scientists are gravitating to that explanation. But actually, a few years ago, another chemist and I wrote an article that was published in an Origins of Life journal called Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres. This is considered to be one of the preeminent Origin of Life journals in the world, where Origin of Life researchers publish their ideas. And most of the articles in this journal are written by atheists. But as Christians and as creationists, we were able to actually publish an article in which we criticized and critiqued membrane-first scenarios. And our criticism was considered to be valid enough that this journal was willing to publish it. And this article is actually based on one of the chapters in the book Origins of Life. And so again, we were actually able to show that membrane-first scenarios basically don't work. So the bottom line is, and if you want the details, the book Origins of Life is a place that you can go if you really want the details. But the bottom line is that if you interact with life scientists, most of them will acknowledge that we don't have an explanation for the origin of life. In other words, the blind watchmaker approach basically fails when it comes to explaining the origin of life. So you have two very powerful observations, right? That life appears to be designed, and that design allows us to make a watchmaker argument for God's existence, and the blind watchmaker approach basically is ineffective. It doesn't work to explain the origin of life, and hence the origin of biochemistry. Two very powerful arguments. But now when you make these kind of arguments, another rebuttal that I commonly see is origin of life researchers will say, yeah, it's true, we don't know how life originates, and it's true that every approach that we've tried has led to failure, but we still think that chemical evolution is the way to go because we can go in the lab and we can replicate different steps that we think took place to produce life through a chemical evolutionary scenario. In other words, origin of life researchers, to study the origin of life, can't time travel. They can't go back in time to the early Earth and watch what happened, so they try to replicate it in a laboratory. They, in effect, are trying to create life in the lab by recapitulating the steps that they think took place on the early Earth to go from simple chemicals to the very first cells. And they've done some remarkable work in the laboratory where they've shown that you can make the building block materials you need for life. They've shown that you can assemble those building blocks into these information-rich polymers, that you can evolve those polymers into functional molecules that can do some very interesting things, that we can generate self-replicating systems in the lab, that we can make even protocells. So scientists, on the basis of this work, have argued that even though we don't know how life originates, we still think chemical evolution is a reasonable approach. And this brings us to the third F, namely attempts to fashion life in the lab, point out this necessary role of intelligent agency in transforming chemicals into living cells. And to appreciate this, we need to think a little bit about what scientists are doing when they step in the lab to try to replicate the origin of life. They are setting up these very elaborate chemical reactions where they have this glass apparatus that they've put together. They are very careful to exclude any kind of materials that would inhibit or contaminate the system. They've got these highly purified solvents, highly purified reactants. They control the order of addition, the amount that's added, the timing it's added. They adjust the pH, the temperature, the pressure. They stop the reaction at the just right time. And so you have these scientists doing all this work in the laboratory, basically involving themselves in the experimental design. The problem is that the work in the laboratory doesn't translate to the conditions of the early Earth. Why? Because there's not organic chemists on the early Earth to basically control the environment to allow that chemistry to take place. So the irony is the work that these scientists are doing to try to demonstrate chemical evolution is a valid way to explain the origin of life have actually shown intelligent agency is critical. And let me just illustrate this by talking about this RNA world hypothesis. This is, again, the scenario that Leslie Orgel referred to as being miraculous, that it would be a miracle if a strand of RNA ever appeared on the primitive Earth. This is a leading idea among origin of life researchers, and the idea is that the very first biochemistry was RNA-based, and then later the DNA protein world was invented through evolutionary processes. And you don't really need to dwell on that too much. But one of the lines of evidence to support this idea of an RNA world is the capacity of RNA building blocks to assemble into RNA chains on clay surfaces. And the thought is that, well, this could have happened on the early Earth. If we had RNA building blocks, that clay could kind of concentrate those building blocks, sequester them, and then serve as a catalyst driving the formation of RNA chains. But when you look at the laboratory work that has been done to show, again, the RNA assembly on clay, what you see is something really interesting, that these researchers are very careful to exclude materials in the experimental design that would inhibit the growth of the RNA chains or cause the RNA chains to break down. And these materials most likely would have been present at high levels on the early Earth. So they've created a chemically pristine environment in the lab that would not have existed on the Earth. They also stop the reaction before the RNA chains get too long, because if they get too long, they irreversibly bind to clay, and if that would have happened on the early Earth, those RNA molecules are out of commission. But you have scientists in the lab knowing that this is going to happen, so they stop that reaction before it takes place. And then also, you've got to get the clay from a special supplier. And that supplier treats the clay in a special way, and then when you get it in the lab, you've got to treat it in a special way and process it before it can serve as a catalyst. You've got to take special types of building blocks that have been chemically modified so that they are more likely to react. And so there's no way that these processes, again, would happen on the early Earth. As Paul Davies said, as far as biochemists can see, it is a long and difficult road to produce efficient RNA replicators from scratch. This conclusion has to be that without a trained organic chemist on hand to supervise, nature would be struggling to make RNA from a dilute soup under any plausible prebiotic conditions. So you can begin to see how Davies is recognizing that this problem is actually pointing us in the direction of intelligent design. Evolutionary biologist Simon Conway Morris goes one step further. Many of the experiments designed to explain one or other step in the origin of life are either of tenuous relevance to any believable prebiotic setting or involve an experimental rig in which the hand of the researcher becomes, for all intents and purposes, the hand of God. And so when we try to create life in the lab, when we try to fashion life in the lab, what we've discovered is, again, intelligent agency is a critical part of that process. And so to me, this provides empirical evidence that an intelligent agent must be involved. And what's interesting is that this conclusion that we can draw from what's called prebiotic chemistry is actually reinforced by work in synthetic biology. This is a relatively new area of biology where scientists are trying to create artificial organisms in a laboratory. And one part of synthetic biology is trying to create protocells from scratch, starting with simple materials. And it turns out that when scientists try to create these protocells, what is necessary is intelligent agency to bring it about. So it reinforces the conclusions of prebiotic chemistry. And just to illustrate that, a few years ago, a team of researchers made from scratch an enzyme, one component of the cell's machinery. They made an enzyme from scratch that could carry out a reaction that was non-biological. And it turns out that to build this enzyme required a team of computational chemists, quantum chemists, protein engineers, biochemists, and molecular biologists. Probably about 20 people were involved in this work to pull it off. And to even develop the strategy to make this enzyme required hundreds of hours of supercomputer time. It required that they used libraries of DNA structures to get insight as to how to build the enzyme. And then they had to go in the laboratory and tinker around with the design to get it to work. And yes, they were successful in making an enzyme, but the enzyme that they made was essentially woefully inadequate compared to what you typically see inside the cell. And this is what they said. Although our results demonstrate that novel enzyme activities can be designed from scratch and indicate the catalytic strategies that are most accessible to nascent enzymes, there's still a significant gap between the activities of our design catalysts and those of naturally occurring enzymes. And so again, synthetic biology is also showing us how important intelligent activity is. And the intelligence that's required to make even an enzyme, it requires the assistance of supercomputer systems to pull it off. So the bottom line is that, intelligent agency is required to bring about the origin of life. And I elaborate on this argument in the book, Creating Life in the Lab, if you want to dig into the details. So we basically have said this, that we see evidence for God's fingerprints in biochemical systems. Again, that allows us to make a watchmaker argument for God's existence. Every attempt to explain where these biochemical systems come from using a blind watchmaker approach has resulted in failure. And then finally, when we try to make life in the lab, when we try to fashion life in the lab, it demonstrates intelligent agency is required. So all you need to do is remember those 3 F's, and if you're engaged in a conversation with a skeptic, hopefully you should be able to recall at least the general principles, these general ideas. But I would submit to you that the most reasonable explanation that accounts for these 3 observations is that life ultimately comes from a creator. And as I mentioned, when I recognized that there was a creator, I was open to the gospel. And it was reading the Sermon on the Mount that convinced me that Jesus must be who Christians claim him to be. I would argue that God revealed himself to me through the record of nature, and that through the words of Scripture, the person of Christ was revealed through the power of the Holy Spirit. And this pastor, Johnny Withrow, who shared the gospel with me, gave me a little booklet about how to become a Christian. And as I read through that booklet, I learned that I was separated from God because of my sin, but yet that through Jesus' death on the cross, that I could be reconciled to the Creator. And I just simply had to acknowledge that Jesus was my Savior through his work on the cross and submit my life to his lordship. And believe in my heart that God raised him from the dead. And through that process, through that humbling of myself before my Creator and depending upon the work of Christ on the cross, I was able to enter into a relationship with the God of the universe. And to me, that is incredibly mind-boggling to think that the God that made the entirety of the heavens, the God that made these elegant designs in biochemical systems, would be interested in having a relationship with me. That is the remarkable promise and the remarkable message of the gospel. So anyway, thank you so much for having me this weekend. I've really enjoyed myself and enjoyed being here. I'm just deeply encouraged at the emphasis that this church is giving on apologetics and the willingness to invest in equipping people in the congregation to be able to defend their faith. But also the hope would be that apologetics would be the impetus for you to be more confident in sharing your faith and more willing to share your faith with other people. So I'm really encouraged to see what this church is doing. And so I encourage you to go out there and to make and to help people see the love that God has for them through the person of Christ.